Welcome to a journey of discovery into one of the most magnificent ancient civilizations ever recorded by humankind. When people think of Iran today, the common images that come to mind are oil war religion and extreme conservatism. But what you're about to hear will unveil an epic chapter few have ever encountered, a glorious ancient Iran that once stood at the heart of three continents, Asia, Europe, and Africa. Long before it was known as Iran, this land was the core of the Persian Empire, one of the earliest empires in human history, once stretching from India to the Mediterranean. The history of Iran can be traced back nearly 5,000 years. Throughout this long journey, the land has witnessed the rise and fall of powerful empires, fierce tribal wars, and even miraculous periods of unification, all of which forged a nation with a cultural and political identity as complex as it is unique. Modern Iran is not only one of the four major powers in the Middle East, but also one of the few nations bold enough to openly challenge the United States, a stance rarely seen on the world stage. But what transformed a once glorious empire of Western Asia into a closed-off, turbulent, and conflicted state as we know it today? Is the slogan Iranian Renaissance merely political theater, or are there deeper historical roots hidden in the shadows? Iran, or more precisely, ancient Persia, also carries within it centuries-old enmity with Israel, fueling endless military tensions. To truly understand this, we must turn back time to the earliest pages of Persian history. Around 4,000 years ago, circa 2000 BCE, two Aryan tribes, the Mysians and the Barakians, modern terms for the Medes and the Persians, began migrating from the Central Asian steppes to the Iranian plateau. The Mysians settled in the northwest near the southern shores of the Caspian Sea, while the Barakians moved southwest toward the area near the Strait of Hormuz. At that time, the Iranian plateau was inhabited by nomadic tribes such as the Padians in the northeast and the indigenous Elamites in the west. The Alamir people were one of the oldest civilizations in Western Asia, as they lived near Mesopotamia, the land often referred to as the cradle of human civilization. Because of this proximity, the Elamir were deeply influenced by the Sumerians. Long before the Mysians and Barakians arrived, the Elamir had already evolved from primitive tribes into organized city-states. By the 16th century BCE, they had unified into a kingdom called Elam, the first organized government in the history of Iran. This kingdom not only engaged in trade with ancient India, one of the four great civilizations of the time, but also famously defeated Babylon in 1155 BCE and brought the renowned code of Hammurabi back to their capital Susa. The kingdom of Elam ruled the Iranian plateau for over 400 years, despite occasional interruptions due to conflict. During this period, the Mysians and Barakians remained minor tribes under the dominance of Elam. However, by the 8th century BCE, the regional power balance began to shift. The Assyrian Empire, a formidable military force of Western Asia, started expanding its territory. Under the weight of brutal invasions, the kingdom of Elam gradually weakened and eventually collapsed. From that point on, the Mysian and Barakian tribes were forced to submit to Assyrian rule. But Assyria was unlike Elam. It was a ruthless empire infamous for its harsh governance. The subjugated populations endured brutal punishments, relentless looting, and merciless exile. This ignited a fire of resistance in the hearts of the Iranian tribes. Ultimately, it was the Mysians under the leadership of brilliant chieftains who rose up, drove the Assyrians out of the Iranian plateau, and paved the way for a new chapter of history to be written. After repelling the Assyrians and reclaiming their freedom, the Mysians, the inhabitants of the Iranian plateau, did not enter a peaceful era as many had hoped. Instead, they plunged into a period of intense chaos. Without a unifying government, the tribes turned on each other in a struggle for power. Violence spread across the land. Raids, vengeance, and feuds among clans turned daily life into a living hell. Many people at the time cried out, "Freedom without justice is just another nightmare." In that dark moment, a leader named Darius emerged. Though he came from a small tribe, he was renowned for his fairness and sharp intellect. Darius did not conquer through violence, but reconciled through integrity. Disputes within his tribe were always resolved with wisdom and compassion, prompting neighboring tribes to seek his judgment in their own conflicts. The fame of Darius spread like fire on a cold night. By 678 BCE, the Mission tribes collectively proclaimed him king and monarch not by noble blood, but by the trust of the people. The city of Fatana was founded as the first capital of the Kingdom of Mis, marking the beginning of a formal royal dynasty on the Iranian plateau. The Kingdom of Mis lasted for 138 years, spanning 4 generations of kings. Among them, the second king, Cyrus, was the one who extended the kingdom's influence beyond its borders. He conquered the Barakian tribes to the south, then launched a campaign westward against the remaining territories of the Assyrian Empire. However, betrayal by their allies, the Scythians, led to the collapse of the campaign. Cyrus died a painful death in battle, and the Kingdom of Mis was plunged into a prolonged crisis that lasted nearly a decade. Yet even in that dark time, a glimmer of light emerged. Cyrus's son Cyrus rose up, defeated the Scythians, and reclaimed the throne. Under Cyrus's rule, the Kingdom of Mis entered its most prosperous era. In 612 BCE, allied with the Neo-Babylonians, Cyrus captured the Assyrian capital of Nineveh and wiped out the once dominant empire that had ruled all of Western Asia. Following the victory, the Mission army marched westward and encountered the Kingdom of Lydia, another powerful force. The two empires engaged in a prolonged war for supremacy, which only came to an end when a solar eclipse occurred. Because both peoples worshipped the sun, this rare phenomenon was seen as a divine omen, prompting both sides to lay down arms and agree to peace. The peace treaty was solidified through a political marriage. A Lydian princess wed Cyrus's son, Prince Asus. The kingdoms of Mis and Lydia became close allies. Meanwhile, the Barakians, who would later become known as the Persians, were experiencing their own time of upheaval. After numerous internal conflicts, a young leader named Cyrus I emerged and succeeded in unifying all the Barakian tribes under his banner. By the end of Cyrus's reign, Prince Asus had become the final king of the Kingdom of Mis. Seeking to strengthen his realm, he married off his daughter to Cyrus I. This very marriage would mark a fateful turning point in the history of ancient Iran. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, a strange legend was passed down about the union between Cyrus I and the Mission princess. One night, King Asus dreamed that his daughter's urine turned into a great flood that swept away the entire kingdom. Terrified upon waking, he turned to the temple priests for an interpretation. They warned him that the daughter would give birth to a child destined to overthrow him. Though intelligent and sharp-witted, Asus was haunted by the dream. When his daughter came of age and became pregnant, he dreamed again, this time of a grapevine growing from her womb and spreading across the entire land. The new prophecy confirmed this child will become king of all Mission territory. Gripped by fear, Asus ordered his daughter to return to the capital and give birth there. When the child, a baby boy, was born, he commanded the infant be killed. However, the high official entrusted with the task couldn't bring himself to commit the deed. Instead, he secretly handed the child over to a shepherd named Ethan. As fate would have it, Ethan's wife had just lost their own child. Thus, the royal infant was raised as a commoner, while the dead body of Ethan's baby was used to stage a ruse, fooling the royal court about the child's fate. 10 years later, the boy, now named Leo, had grown up and often played with the village children. One day, during a game where they acted out roles, Leo was chosen as the king and began issuing orders to the other children. One boy, the son of a noble family, refused to obey and was harshly punished by Leo. The young noble cried and ran home to tell his father. Furious, the nobleman took his son and went straight to the royal court to file a complaint. When King Asus heard about the matter, he ordered a thorough investigation. Slowly, all clues began to point toward the shepherd Ethan. Fearing the consequences, Ethan was eventually forced to reveal the entire truth. The shepherd Ethan, overwhelmed by fear, finally confessed everything. To the shock of the court, he declared that the child he had raised for the past 10 years was not his own, but in fact the biological grandson of King Asus, the son of the Mission princess. The crowd was stunned. The air in the courtroom grew heavy with tension. At that moment, the old priest, the same one who had once interpreted the king's dreams, stepped forward slowly and spoke. This child was once chosen to be king in a children's game. According to ancient signs, he who has once ruled shall never ascend the throne again. His fate has already passed. Those words were like a calming elixir for King Assus. He breathed a sigh of relief, convinced that the curse no longer held power. So he allowed his grandson to be taken back to Barakan, the land where the boy's mother now lived, and from that point on, never spoke again of the dark destiny foretold in his dreams. This story, according to the Greek historian Herodotus, became part of the legendary origins of the great rise of the Persian people. Though not fully verified, later historical evidence supports one key fact: Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Persian Empire, did indeed carry royal Mysian blood from his mother's side. In Mysian society, the Barakans, the ancestors of the Persians, had long been regarded as inferior, treated as second-class citizens. They were looked down upon, exploited, and forced to do hard labor with no opportunity for advancement. But as the Barakan tribes grew stronger, so did their discontent, simmering like molten lava beneath the surface. In 553 BCE, Cyrus, now fully grown and recognized as the supreme leader of the Barakan people, made a decision no one expected. He commanded all his people to join in cultivating a barren, uninhabited land. They poured their strength into the task and astonishingly completed it within a single day. As the evening fell, Cyrus, making a surprising move, ordered all his livestock slaughtered to host a grand feast for the people. The Barakans, exhausted and starving, were overwhelmed with emotion when they saw the fragrant roasted meat and wine flowing like streams. Joy swept through the crowd. When the feast was nearing its end, Cyrus slowly stood up, looked them in the eyes, and asked, "Today you toiled hard all day, but in return you received a meal worthy of your effort. If you had a choice, would you rather live a life of slavery or enjoy meals like this every day?" The crowd fell silent, then responded in unison, "We want meat." Cyrus's eyes burned with fire as he looked at them. "Then why must we the Barakans bow before the Mysians? Why do they live inside great cities eating meat while we kneel in the fields? We are no less than them, and we deserve a different future." His words ignited a storm. Blood surged in the veins of the Barakans. With one heart, they took up sickles, axes, banners, and swore loyalty to Cyrus. The uprising had begun. The Barakans seized the city of Persepolis and established a new dynasty, the Achaemenid Empire, also known as the First Persian Empire. From Persepolis, Cyrus launched a war against the Mysians. The war lasted 3 years. With Cyrus's brilliant leadership and the unwavering loyalty of the Barakan people, they defeated the Mysians, capturing Susa, the ancient capital of Elam, and later Batana, once the capital of Mis. From then on, the Barakans not only overthrew centuries of foreign rule, but also became the new masters of the Iranian plateau. However, new power brought new threats. To the west, the kingdom of Lydia began to feel uneasy at the rise of the Persian Empire. King Cyrus of Lydia, one of the wealthiest and most powerful monarchs of the time, decided to strike first. In 547 BCE, Lydia launched an invasion into Persian territory. The first battle ended in a stalemate with both sides evenly matched, but Lydia, with fewer troops, was forced to retreat while awaiting reinforcements. What Cyrus did not expect was that Cyrus would not remain on the defensive. The moment the Lydians withdrew, Cyrus struck back with lightning speed, launching a surprise offensive deep into Lydia's heartland. The swift counterattack caught the Lydian army completely off guard. However, Lydia was no weakling. It was a Western powerhouse, home to the most formidable cavalry in all of Asia at the time. The coming battle would be a clash of legends, a fateful confrontation whose outcome would determine the true master of the age. After the Persian counterattack, King Cyrus of Lydia quickly rallied his elite cavalry and launched a fierce retaliation. Despite their courage, the Persian troops were no match for Lydia's battle-hardened horsemen, one of the most powerful cavalry forces in ancient history. They suffered repeated defeats on the battlefield, and this string of losses plunged Cyrus the Great into a state of deep anxiety. But then, just when all seemed lost, a close general proposed an unexpected plan: send the supply-carrying camels to the front lines. It sounded strange, but it was a stroke of genius. Camels have a distinct odor that war horses had never encountered before. As expected, when the camel units were deployed, the Lydian horses panicked. They neighed wildly, kicked about, and bolted in all directions, throwing the cavalry into utter disarray. Meanwhile, the camels, calm by nature, remained steady, unaffected by the chaos. It was this battle of camels versus horses that turned the tide of the entire conflict. The Lydian cavalry was crushed, and from that point on, many Western Asian kingdoms began to value the use of camel cavalry, a tactic that remains in use in some regions, even today. Not long after this defeat, Lydia, now stripped of its military advantage, was swiftly overrun by the Persian army. Cyrus divided his forces into two wings. One marched westward, crossed the Bosporus Strait, entered Europe, and conquered the scattered Greek city-states on the Balkan Peninsula. Meanwhile, Cyrus himself led the Eastern Front, pushing deep into Central Asia, expanding the empire's borders all the way to the Indus River basin. At that time, the Persian Empire swept across every land it touched like a storm. Each battle, each territory, conquered with ease. However, one final fortress remained a near-impregnable city, New Babylon. Babylon was a symbol of power and prosperity, one of the greatest cities of the ancient world. Surrounding the city were vast moats and towering walls wide enough for four-horse chariots to ride atop. Its gates, made entirely of bronze, were so sturdy that any siege attempt was rendered futile. Within the city stood the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. With its large population and fertile lands, Babylon was fully self-sufficient, unafraid of long-term sieges. When Cyrus the Great faced this steel-clad wall, it seemed even he had reached an impasse. But then an unexpected event unfolded. Inside Babylon, the ruling class fell into conflict. The priesthood became dissatisfied with the king's efforts to alter their long-standing religious traditions. In the end, it was the priests themselves who opened the gates, surrendering to the Persian army. Babylon, the most fortified city on earth, had fallen without a single arrow being fired. Babylon became the fourth capital of the Persian Empire. Upon entering the city, Cyrus granted a general amnesty and liberated thousands of Jews who had been enslaved during earlier conquests. To the Jewish people, Cyrus was more than a king, he was a messiah. A truly great leader, he not only expanded borders, but ruled with compassion. In every land he passed through, Cyrus maintained a policy of religious tolerance, an extremely rare practice for that time. After stabilizing Babylon, Cyrus continued his eastern campaigns, but in a fierce battle with the nomadic Massagetæ tribe, he was tragically killed. His son Cambyses II succeeded him. But unlike his father, Cambyses was a cruel tyrant. Upon ascending the throne, he murdered his own brother to secure power, then concentrated all military might toward Egypt. Eventually, he conquered Egypt, creating the first empire in human history to span 3 continents, Asia, Europe, and Africa. However, the relentless wars brought suffering to the people, and resentment began to grow. In 522 BCE, while enjoying his reign in Egypt back in Persia, a priest named Gaumata, claiming to be the deceased brother of Cambyses, launched a rebellion. He gained strong support from the Mission nobility, and the uprising exploded across the land. Cambyses rushed home, but died suddenly along the way, leaving the empire plunged into chaos. Eventually, a distant cousin of his, Darius, successfully crushed the rebellion and ascended the throne, becoming Darius the Great. Under Darius's reign, the Persian Empire entered its golden age. He carried out comprehensive reforms in politics, economics, and the military. Darius divided the empire into administrative provinces, each governed by a satrap, laying the foundation for the province-governor system that would later be adopted and inherited by Western empires such as Rome, Alexander's empire, the Arabs, and the Ottomans. He also built 2 great highways running east to west, connecting the entire empire with a total length of 2,400 kilometers, which was 600 kilometers longer than the famous road later built by China's Qin Shi Huang. Darius's philosophy of governance not only helped him maintain control over a vast empire, but also inspired future superpowers, those empires that would one day dominate the world. Starting in 499 BCE, a historic confrontation between the Persian Empire and the Greek city-states officially erupted, known as the Greco-Persian Wars. This war lasted nearly half a century, and during this time, legendary tales became etched into history: the Battle of Marathon, the heroic last stand at Thermopylae by the 300 Spartan warriors, icons of courage and defiance. In the early years of the war, the Persian Empire completely held the upper hand. Their massive army once occupied nearly 2/3 of Greek territory, advancing all the way to Athens, the heart of Western knowledge and thought. It was a dark moment when all of Western civilization seemed to be suffocating under the grip of the Eastern Empire. Yet history is never a straight path. After their initial defeats, the Greek city-states gradually regained the initiative in naval battles. From the brutality of war, the Greeks found the light of unity. Step by step, they pushed back the Persian forces, eventually forcing the mighty empire to retreat exhausted in both manpower and resources. However, just as the external enemy withdrew, a new crisis erupted from within. The Greek city-states quickly fractured and plunged into civil war. The Delian League, led by Athens, and the Peloponnesian League, led by Sparta, began vying for dominance, dragging the Greek peninsula into a vicious cycle of fratricidal conflict. Sensing an opportunity, the Persian Empire put aside its swords and adopted a political strategy, quietly manipulating, dividing, and controlling the city-states through covert alliances. Yet while the southern Greeks were mired in internal strife, a new power was rising in the north, the Macedonians. The Macedonians were considered a Hellenized people. They revered Greek civilization, but refused to be ruled by anyone. Then in 337 BCE, King Philip II of Macedonia, a brilliant strategist, defeated the rebellious city-states and formed a new Greek league, establishing himself as supreme commander. He declared, "We shall avenge Persia." But just as this great campaign was about to begin, Philip II was suddenly assassinated. The world believed the dream of vengeance had died with him. No one expected that his 20-year-old son Alexander would inherit his father's will and go on to build one of the greatest empires in human history. By then, Persia was already rotting from within. A series of coups, weak kings ascending the throne only to be swiftly overthrown one after another. When Alexander's army approached Mesopotamia, Persia finally scrambled to resist. The reigning king Darius III mobilized all forces, marching a grand army to the plains of Issus, where the open terrain favored cavalry warfare. However, Alexander was a master strategist. He didn't launch a frontal assault. Instead, he waited until Darius moved closer to the city of Issus to secure supplies, then launched a surprise attack. The narrow terrain of Issus made the vast Persian army as cramped as a snake, unable to stretch its body. The cavalry couldn't perform effectively. The large army was thrown into chaos. Although the Persian forces still held superiority in both numbers and morale, the turning point came when the central unit, where Darius III himself was stationed, was suddenly ambushed. In a moment of panic, Darius fled, abandoning his soldiers in the midst of battle. The king's retreat shattered the army's spirit. The Persian forces suffered a devastating defeat, and Darius's mother, wife, and children fell into Alexander's hands, a humiliation unlike any before. In despair, Darius wrote a letter to Alexander begging for peace. He offered his daughter's hand in marriage and half of the empire as dowry, hoping Alexander would withdraw his forces. But Alexander, with the air of a triumphant god, coldly replied, "I do not want Darius's gold or his land. Sooner or later, his entire empire will belong to me. And as for his daughter, if I choose to marry her, Darius has no right to refuse." With those words, Alexander declared war not only with weapons, but with an unyielding will, one that compelled history itself to bow. According to legend, Darius III's queen, known as Statera, was among the most beautiful women of the Persian Empire. Her beauty was said to be enough to shake the world. Their daughter Statera II was equally stunning, a dazzling jewel in the splendid royal court. Yet the most astonishing part was that Alexander, the young warrior who had conquered half the known world, treated them with the utmost respect. There was no act of violation, no disgrace, only courtesy and dignity, something rarely seen in the brutal wars of antiquity. After Alexander rejected the peace offer, Darius III had no choice but to enter one final decisive battle. In 331 BCE, he summoned an enormous army and made his stand at Gaugamela, a battle renowned as the largest in Alexander's entire 10-year campaign to conquer the East. And as if cursed by fate, Darius III dashed every last hope once again. When the battle reached its midpoint and the tide began to turn in Alexander's favor, Darius fled for a second time. The morale of the Persian army collapsed with the king's retreat, and once more defeat was inevitable. Darius escaped to Bactria, but even there on the land he once ruled, he was betrayed and killed by his own satrap, a man named Bessus. When Alexander heard the news, he used Darius's death as a legitimate pretext to advance and annex all of Bactria, executing Bessus as a traitor. Afterward, Alexander led his army back to Susa, the second capital of Persia, where he began establishing a new order. There he married Darius III's daughter, officially becoming the rightful heir to the Persian Empire, thus ending the independent existence of one of the oldest and most powerful empires of the East. But Alexander did not stop there. He continued his campaign eastward, crossing treacherous mountains and desolate deserts, advancing all the way to the Indus River basin. And it was there, after completing his great mission, that he finally ordered a return to Babylon. By that time, the empire he had built stretched across 3 continents from the Mediterranean to the borders of India, becoming one of the largest empires in the history of mankind. Although Alexander brought Greek culture to the far corners of the world in politics, he wisely retained many of Persia's traditional institutions. He believed that a fusion between the two civilizations would bring lasting stability. Under his rule, many Persian nobles continued to hold high-ranking positions in government, serving as advisors and mentors to the Greek elite. Thanks to this integration, the age-old enmity between the Greeks and Persians, one that had lasted for over 2 centuries, finally came to an end. But that peace did not last. In 323 BCE, just as Alexander was planning a new campaign to conquer the Arabian Peninsula, he suddenly fell gravely ill and died at the age of 33 at the height of his power. His death came so unexpectedly that he had no time to appoint a successor, and his son had yet to be born. With no leader to guide it, the vast empire began to fracture. Not long after, his closest generals plunged into a fierce power struggle. Among them, General Seleucus emerged as the one who came to control the entire region of Central and Western Asia, including the Iranian plateau. From there, he founded the Seleucid dynasty, inheriting most of the eastern portion of Alexander's empire. However, his rule was far from stable. While Seleucus was preoccupied with conflicts in the west, especially with Egypt ruled by Ptolemy, the native peoples of the eastern frontier continually rose up in rebellion. By 247 BCE, a nomadic tribe from the southeast of the Caspian Sea, the Parthians seized the opportunity as the Seleucids were mired in conflict with Egypt to declare independence. Their leader Arsaces quickly established the Parthian Empire, also known as the Arsacid dynasty. Although the Seleucids later launched counterattacks and temporarily regained much of the territory, they could not maintain long-term control. Then in the early 2nd century CE, another seismic shift occurred. In the west, a new power was rising: Rome. Like a brilliant star emerging in the European sky, the Roman Empire began expanding its influence throughout the region. Under growing pressure, King Phraates of Parthia officially declared the end of Seleucid overlordship. Parthia split its forces into 2 wings. One advanced eastward, conquering the entire Central Asian region, modern-day Turkmenistan. The other moved westward, driving the Seleucids out of Syria. Step by step, Parthia came to control the entire territory once held by the Seleucids. And so history turned another page, a new chapter, written by those who refused to bow to fate. By the end of Mithridates' reign, the Parthian Empire had expanded to become one of the 4 great powers of the ancient world, standing alongside Rome, China's Han Dynasty, and the Kushan Kingdom. Existing during the classical era, these empires not only clashed in war, but were also connected through a legendary route, the Silk Road. It was during Parthian rule that the Han Dynasty opened a major trade route linking east and west. Parthia, acting as a grand bridge, became an essential crossroads between the 2 civilizations, facilitating the exchange of goods, ideas, and culture. Merchants traveling from Rome to China, from the Persian deserts to the capital of Chang'an, all had to pass through Parthian territory, a land both mysterious and strategically vital. Yet that position also made them a constant target of conflict. As Parthia's borders came to touch the Roman Empire, its history entered a new phase, an era of fire and blood, the centuries-long war against Roman invasions. Thanks to their elite heavy cavalry, undaunted warriors on desert horses, and the rugged terrain of their homeland, the Parthians repeatedly defeated powerful Roman legions. They even killed Crassus, one of the 3 pillars of the Roman First Triumvirate, and recaptured the prosperous region of Armenia, a sharp blow to Rome's eastern ambitions. However, in this endless war, neither side truly prevailed. Rome paid a steep price for its distant expeditions. Weary troops depleted treasuries. To maintain numbers, the Romans increasingly relied on hiring mercenaries, many from the so-called barbarian tribes. Gradually, the Roman army lost its identity and discipline, one of the deep-rooted causes behind the eventual division and fall of that great empire. Meanwhile, Parthia fared no better. Prolonged war with Rome drained the population. War taxes became an unbearable burden. Faith was shaken and society grew divided. Though Parthian kings claimed descent from Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Persian Empire, this was not enough to convince the native Persian nobility. They saw the Parthians as outsiders, not true bearers of the nation's soul. From that point on, many noble warlords began carving out their own territories, raising private armies, and waiting for the right moment to overthrow the Parthian dynasty. And eventually that moment arrived. In 224 CE, a leader from the priestly Sasanian lineage, Artaxerxes, rose up and called upon all of Persia to rally behind him. He raised the banner of restored glory, ignited national spirit, and gained the support of much of the Persian aristocracy. After 2 years of fierce battles, he completely defeated the Parthian dynasty. The Sasanian Empire was officially born, marking a great revival of Persian civilization. This is considered the second Persian Empire in history. The Sasanian family were not merely nobles, they were the highest-ranking priestly class of Zoroastrianism, the sacred national religion of ancient Persia. Their ancestor Sasan had been a great high priest of the faith, and if you've ever wondered why fire is revered by Persians as a sacred element, this is the reason. Zoroastrianism teaches that the universe is a battleground between two eternal forces, light and darkness, good and evil. Humans are born to stand with the light to resist the darkness through willpower, virtue, and sacrifice. Therefore, fire, representing light, became a symbol of faith, courage, and divine strength. This eternal flame was worshipped in sacred temples, burning endlessly as an undying vow to the gods. Over time, the doctrines of Zoroastrianism deeply influenced many other religions. It absorbed elements from Judaism and Christianity, and eventually gave rise to Manichaeism, the prominent dualistic faith of light and darkness in the ancient world. When Manichaeism reached China, it transformed into the Mingjiao, the bright sect, famously depicted in Jin Young's martial arts novel, The Heaven Sword and Dragon Saber. Its stronghold, Guangming Peak, Bright Summit, and the symbol of the sacred flame order all originated from the legends of ancient Persian Zoroastrianism. Because the Sasanian family carried priestly blood, they did more than re-establish an empire, they revived an entire culture, a belief system, and a national soul that had long been buried. And as their territory expanded across Central and Western Asia, Zoroastrianism, like an eternal flame, spread far and wide, even influencing the eventual development of Islam. In the early years following the founding of the Sasanian dynasty, the Persian Empire once again rose to power, and as if fulfilling an inescapable destiny, it entered a new confrontation with its ancient nemesis, the Roman Empire. In 239 CE, when Artaxerxes died, the imperial throne passed to his son, Shapur the Emir. But Shapur inherited more than just the crown, he inherited ambition to conquer and expand. During his reign, he repeatedly defeated Roman forces, spreading the fame of Sasanian Persia throughout the ancient world. The most resounding highlight was his capture of the Roman Emperor Valerian, an unprecedented humiliation in the history of that mighty empire. A stone relief depicting Valerian kneeling before Shapur still survives today, a lasting testament to Persia's golden age. But the brighter the light, the deeper the shadow. After the death of Shapur, Warren, the Sasanian Empire was plunged into a spiral of power struggles among royal factions. The Zoroastrian priesthood, once the spiritual backbone of the empire, began to entangle itself in politics, triggering a series of deposals, uprisings, and bloodshed. The crisis peaked in 309 CE, when the priests plotted the assassination of Emperor Hormuz II. His 3 eldest sons were either murdered or imprisoned one by one, until something strange occurred. The throne was given to an unborn child. That child was Shapur II. The priest crowned his mother's womb, proclaiming that the future king had officially been anointed while still in utero. And so the child grew up among palaces and temples, raised by the most powerful priests and thoroughly immersed in the teachings of Zoroastrianism. When he came of age, Shapur II became the embodiment of a warrior king, strong, devoted, and full of authority. He launched a campaign to suppress Christians within the empire, forcing them to convert to Zoroastrianism, an act that gave Rome, which had by then officially adopted Christianity as its state religion, a pretext to launch a new war. But Rome underestimated its opponent. Before the war broke out, Shapur II had already trained one of the most elite armies of the time, an army capable of rivaling any world power. He marched deep into Central Asia, defeated the Persian Empire, and gained full control over what is now Afghanistan. When Rome invaded, his forces struck back fiercely, not only repelling the enemy, but also capturing vast territories in Western Asia. Even the Roman Emperor Julian, nicknamed the Apostate, was killed at the hands of Persian soldiers. After this resounding victory, Shapur II signed a truce on the terms of a victor. From that moment, the Sasanian Empire reached the peak of its power. They controlled the entire trade route of the Silk Road, the lifeline connecting Asia, Europe, and Africa. For a long time, Persia held a monopoly on the silk trade with China. Persian merchants flooded major cities like Chang'an, bringing not only goods but also culture and religion. Through these trading expeditions, Zoroastrianism entered China and left a lasting influence on local philosophy and belief systems. However, after Shapur II's death, the empire plunged into another dark period. His successors were weak and indulgent, living in decadence, which allowed the once suppressed Zoroastrian clergy and aristocracy to rise again. Provincial governors, empowered like miniature kings, began carving out their own domains, gradually eroding the authority of the central government. Fortunately, Persia's old nemesis, the Roman Empire, was also mired in internal crisis at the time. In 395, Rome officially split into two: Eastern Rome, Byzantium, and Western Rome. In its attempt to restore former glory, Byzantium chose to avoid direct conflict with the Sasanians, ushering in a temporary period of stability for the Eastern Empire. By 498, another legendary figure emerged, Kavad, who ascended the throne at just 15 years old amid a time of national turmoil. Having once been deposed and exiled, he understood all too well the cost of unstable power. After reclaiming the throne, Kavad began a sweeping reform, reorganizing the government, centralizing authority within the royal court, and steering the nation into a period of strong centralization. His son Khosrow carried on the reformist legacy. Known as the Just King or the Philosopher King, he not only stabilized internal affairs, but also elevated royal power to new heights. He crushed the Hephthalites, a people who had plagued Persia's borders for centuries. Then he turned his attention to the Arab Peninsula, launching campaigns against small kingdoms there and redirecting trade routes toward the Persian Gulf, transforming the region into a strategic economic hub. Beyond his military prowess, Khosrow was a patron of culture and knowledge. He imported thousands of rare manuscripts from India, had them translated into Pahlavi, and enriched Persian cultural and philosophical heritage. Under his reign, the light of knowledge and power shone brightly, making Persia not only a mighty empire, but also one of profound humanism and vision. During the golden age of the Sasanian dynasty, it was not only military triumphs that spread far and wide, but also intellect. The ancient board game, the precursor to modern international chess, was brought from India into Iran. Under the refinement of Persian scholars and nobles, this game became one of the great symbols of Eastern intellect, eventually reaching Europe and captivating even the Western aristocracy. In 579 AD, Khosrow, warmer known as the King of Justice, passed away, ending a glorious 48-year reign. The throne was passed on to his son Hormizd IV. However, only 10 years later, Hormizd was overthrown in a brutal palace coup. Power quickly fell into the hands of Khosrow's grandson, Khosrow II, after he committed a horrific act, gouging out the eyes and executing his own father to eliminate any threat to his claim. This ruthless act enraged Persia's greatest general at the time, Bahram Shobin. Refusing to submit, he raised the banner of rebellion, declared himself king, and gathered forces from the borderlands to challenge the central authority. In desperation, Khosrow II was forced to flee to the Byzantine Empire and begged Emperor Maurice for help, promising allegiance in return. The Byzantines believed him and sent reinforcements. After reclaiming the throne, Khosrow II immediately broke the treaty and turned his back on his former ally, shamelessly betraying his promise. By 602, Emperor Maurice was assassinated, plunging the Byzantine Empire into deep chaos. Seizing the opportunity, Khosrow II launched a massive invasion and conquered vast territories, including Syria, Egypt, and Anatolia. The climax came when Persian forces laid siege to Constantinople, nearly forcing the new emperor Heraclius to abandon the city and flee. But Heraclius did not collapse. Backed by the Christian church, he launched a great holy war, rallying the empire's full strength for a counteroffensive. With unshakable faith and brilliant strategy, he drove his army deep into the heart of the Sasanian Empire. The decisive battle took place in 627 at Nineveh. There, Persia suffered a devastating defeat. Khosrow the Tyranny was forced to return all the Byzantine territories he had previously conquered. The Sasanian Empire, once as radiant as the rising sun, began to fall apart. Less than a year later, Khosrow's son Kavad II repeated his father's deed, assassinating Khosrow to seize the throne. But the tragedy did not end there. No sooner had Kavad II ascended than the Arabian Peninsula began to tremble under the light of a great revolution led by the Prophet Muhammad. The Islamic conquest erupted. The Arabs, newly unified across the peninsula, were now ready to step onto the world stage. In a separate video about Islamic history, we have detailed that process. But here let us return to Sasanian Persia. After the defeat at Nineveh, the empire was but a shadow of its former self. In 642, the Battle of Nahavand, the final confrontation between the Sasanian army and the Arabs, ended in tragic fashion. The Persian forces were completely annihilated. The last king, Yazdegerd III, began a hopeless journey of fleeing across his ancestral lands. In despair, he sent his son Peroz and nephew Narseh to China, seeking aid from Emperor Gaozong of the Tang dynasty, hoping for salvation from the east. But that hope quickly faded. The Tang court refused to intervene. Peroz and Narseh were forced to settle permanently in China, becoming exiled royals who would never return to their homeland. As for Yazdegerd III, the last emperor of the Sasanian dynasty, he did not die on the battlefield but was killed by a lowly slave. In 651 AD, the Sasanian Empire officially collapsed, closing the curtain on a magnificent historical chapter that had lasted over 200 years on the Iranian plateau. From that moment, the land of Persia, once the heart of the ancient world, became part of the Arab Empire. It was no longer the battleground of empires, but a grand meeting point of two civilizations, Persia and Islam. Language, religion, and culture began to blend, creating a new current of history, ushering in an era that we will explore in the next episode. Thank you for staying with us until the final moment of this grand journey. Prepare yourself, because the ancient world never truly sleeps, and its secrets are still waiting to be revealed.